I still remember the hum of the fluorescent lights above me. It was the kind of sound you don't notice on a normal day, but on that morning it was all I could hear, steady, irritating, like a swarm of flies in the back of my skull. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, the scent of every tired Monday morning I had endured for 2 years. I sat in the second row of chairs, close enough to see the owner's polished shoes tapping against the floor, but far enough that I couldn't quite escape his shadow. We were all there, maybe 20 of us, lined up like school children waiting for a lecture. Nobody spoke much. We all knew why we'd been called in. The rumors had been circling for weeks. No raises this year. Again. The words had filtered down in whispers, but no one wanted to believe them. I had clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, the silence was only because something better was coming. I'd convinced myself that the late nights I'd given, the weekends I'd sacrificed, the times I'd chosen work over family, they meant something. Surely they had to. Then he walked in. The owner, Frank. A man who wore confidence like a cologne. Thick, choking, impossible to ignore. And trailing a few steps behind him, as always, was his wife. She never had a role in the company, but she hovered at his side like a queen surveying her kingdom. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Frank didn't waste time with pleasantries. He cleared his throat, adjusted the gleaming Rolex on his wrist, and spoke in that booming voice he liked to use when he wanted to sound commanding. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "The economy is tight. Times are tough. I know you've all been working hard, but we can't afford raises this year." The words fell heavy, but familiar. We'd heard them before. Last year. The year before that. Only this time, something was different. His tone wasn't apologetic. It was sharp, almost defiant. I glanced around the room. Some of my co-workers dropped their eyes to the table. Others stared at him with a quiet kind of anger. No one dared to interrupt. Frank went on, "This is the reality. If you don't like it, there's the door. I'm not here to sugarcoat things. We have to be efficient. We have to be lean. That's just business." Something in me snapped. It wasn't his words. They were the same excuses we'd been fed for years. It was the way he said them, as if our struggles were an inconvenience to him, as if the long hours and loyalty we gave meant nothing. And then, as if fate wanted to drive the knife deeper, I caught it. The quick exchange of glances between Frank and his wife. She wasn't even pretending to hide it. Her smirk was small but unmistakable, the kind of look people share when they're in on a private joke. And just like that, everything I'd tried to ignore came flooding back. The rumors, the whispers about the house, I'd brushed it off at first. Just jealous gossip, I told myself. But then, I'd seen the photos online. A sprawling $1-million home in the suburbs. 2 brand-new luxury SUVs parked in the driveway, each costing more than my annual salary. All of it purchased in the same years we'd been told, sorry, no budget for raises. And now here he was, lecturing us about sacrifice. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to shout. But instead I sat frozen, my hands clenched together in my lap, my wedding ring pressing painfully into my finger. That ring had always symbolized commitment to me, promises made and kept. But in that moment it felt heavy, almost mocking. Frank must have sensed the tension because he changed his tone. He leaned forward, hands spread across the table, and said, "Look, I get it. Some of you might not like this. So here's what I'll do. If anyone feels they can't stay, I'll make you an offer. $4,500. Cash. You can walk away today. I'll even file it so you can collect unemployment. No hard feelings." The room went silent. His words hung there like smoke. I looked around again. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Most avoided eye contact. It was a test, and we all knew it. He wanted to see who was desperate enough to take the bait, who would cling to the scraps he threw at us. And maybe that's what broke me most of all, that he thought he owned us so completely, that we needed him so badly, we'd see this as generosity. For a moment, I felt shame. Was this all I was worth? 2 years of my life, traded for $4,500 and a pat on the back. But then, something inside me shifted. The shame burned away, replaced by something sharper, cleaner, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. He thought I was trapped. He thought I had no choice. But the truth was, maybe I had been trapping myself all along. My heart pounded as I stood. The chair scraped loudly against the tile, drawing every pair of eyes in the room. Frank raised an eyebrow, surprised. His wife tilted her head, her smirk deepening. "I'll take it," I heard myself say. For a second, silence. Then Frank nodded, almost amused, and motioned for one of the HR clerks to bring me the paperwork. My hands shook as I signed, not from fear, but from the rush of finality. When it was done, I slid the papers back across the table. Frank gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Best of luck," he said, like he was dismissing a child. I walked out, past the rows of co-workers who wouldn't meet my gaze, past the wife in the doorway, her perfume thick and cloying in the air, out into the cold sunlight of the parking lot. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how I'd pay the bills, or what tomorrow would look like. All I knew was this: I was never crawling back. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt fraught. Ciao. I still remember my first day at the company like it was yesterday. It was spring, the kind of morning when the air carried just enough warmth to make you believe in beginnings. I had put on my best shirt, the blue one my wife once said brought out the colour of my eyes, and polished the old leather shoes I'd worn through 2 interviews. The building itself wasn't impressive, a squat beige office with windows that never quite let the sun in. But when I walked through the doors, I felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just another job. It was a chance at stability, at building something lasting. Frank was waiting in the lobby that day. He shook my hand firmly, clapped me on the shoulder like we were already old friends, and said, "Welcome to the family." That word, family, it hooked me. I had been drifting between short-term gigs, contracts that ended as soon as they began. My resume was patchwork, and my confidence had frayed along the edges. When Frank spoke about family values, about long-term growth, about loyalty being rewarded, I believed him. Maybe I needed to. The first weeks were a blur of long hours and quiet pride. I dove into the work with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to prove myself, to show that I wasn't just another name on payroll, I was someone they could rely on. And at first, it felt like I mattered. There were small victories. A project finished ahead of schedule, a client who praised my attention to detail. I started staying late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was a satisfaction in leaving the office long after the sun had set, the parking lot nearly empty except for my car and Frank's black SUV. Sometimes, on those late nights, Frank would pass by my desk, pat me on the back and say, "That's the kind of dedication that gets remembered." He'd glance at the cheap wristwatch I wore, the one my father had given me, before he passed, and comment, "You're a man who values time. That's rare." Those words stuck with me. Every time I looked at that watch, I thought about how my time was being noticed, appreciated. But appreciation, I would learn, is not the same as respect. Months turned into years. The company grew. New contracts came in. The office expanded. Frank's voice grew louder in meetings. And with each new milestone, I told myself, my turn will come. I just have to be patient. When the first raise never arrived, I convinced myself the company was still finding its footing. When the second year passed, I swallowed the disappointment, told myself they would remember who had been there since the early days. Meanwhile, the sacrifices piled up like stones on my chest. There was the anniversary dinner I missed because a client deadline changed at the last minute. My wife sat alone at the restaurant, her text unread on my phone until after midnight. There was the family reunion I skipped, promising my mother I'd make the next one. She passed away before I ever did. I told myself it was worth it, that one day all those missed moments would add up to something. But deep down, I knew I was bargaining with myself, trading present happiness for a future I couldn't see. I remember one night, sitting at the kitchen table long after my wife had gone to bed. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I'd loosened my tie, rubbed the fatigue from my eyes, and stared at the unpaid bills spread across the table. My watch ticked steadily, indifferent to my exhaustion. I whispered to myself, "Just hold on a little longer. They'll come through." It was easier to believe in promises than to face the truth, that I had tied my identity to a company that saw me as replaceable. Friends warned me. "Don't trust him," they said. "Frank talks a good game, but he'll use you until you're dry." Co-workers joked in hushed tones about raises that never came, about the owner's lavish dinners while we ate cold leftovers at our desks. But when I looked at Frank, at the way he spoke with such conviction about loyalty, I wanted to believe I was different, that I wasn't just another name on his list of expendables. I clung to that belief like a lifeline. And then came the house. It started as a rumor. A co-worker who lived near the suburbs said he'd seen the construction, the gated driveway, the movers hauling in furniture. At first, I brushed it off. People like to gossip. But then, one afternoon, someone pulled up the listing online. There it was, a sprawling $1 million home. White pillars at the entrance, a pool glittering in the backyard, wide windows that reflected the sky, and in the driveway, 2 brand-new SUVs gleaming in the sun. Each vehicle cost more than my annual salary. I stared at the photos for a long time, unable to breathe. My throat tightened. My chest felt hollow. All those nights I told my wife we had to wait until next year. All the times I promised her we'd finally take that trip. All the moments I excused our empty savings account. Because Frank said times were tight. And there he was, living a life built on the hours I gave him for free. That night, I couldn't look at my wife when she asked how work was. I kissed her forehead, mumbled, "Fine," and went to bed early, my heart pounding with something I couldn't name yet. But I still stayed. Because leaving meant admitting I'd wasted years. Leaving meant facing the truth, that I wasn't part of a family. I was part of a machine. And machines don't love the gears they grind. I told myself to hold on, that maybe things weren't what they seemed. Maybe he deserved the house. Maybe he had worked harder than I realized. I built excuses in my head like scaffolding to hold up a collapsing wall. But deep down, I knew. Every time I fastened my watch in the morning, I felt its weight differently. It no longer felt like a reminder of my father's words about valuing time. It felt like a chain, each tick reminding me that I was giving my hours to someone who saw them as disposable. And every night, when I slipped off my wedding ring and placed it carefully on the nightstand, I couldn't ignore the question gnawing at me. How many vows had I broken in the name of loyalty to a man who never intended to honor his own? The first few hours after I walked out of that meeting felt like flight. My heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through my veins, as if I'd broken free from a prison I hadn't realized I'd been living in. The cold air outside tasted different, sharper, cleaner. But freedom has a way of curdling once the silence sets in. By that evening, the weight of what I'd done started to sink in. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a diner, staring at the folder of paperwork in the passenger seat. The check inside felt like a cruel joke. $4,500 in exchange for 2 years of loyalty, late nights, missed anniversaries, and a piece of my soul I'd never get back. I lit the dashboard with my phone screen, scrolling through job listings. The numbers blurred together. Every position wanted 5 years of proven experience or certifications I didn't have, or paid less than what I'd been scraping by on. My thumb froze over the screen. I locked the phone and leaned back, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes. My watch ticked steadily on my wrist, mocking me. Every second that passed seemed to whisper, "You're running out of time." The first week blurred. I slept late, then stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling. I told my wife I was figuring things out, but the truth was, I was unraveling. The bills came as they always did, indifferent to my unraveling. Each envelope that slid through the mail slot carried the same silent accusation. "You don't have this under control." I piled them on the kitchen table, unopened, like I could will them away by refusing to look. I tried to apply for jobs, but every rejection email felt like another stow, tied to my chest. I stopped checking after a while. The silence was worse than rejection. It was during those nights, long, dark hours when the house was quiet, that the collapse really took hold. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey, the bills spread out in front of me, and I'd stare at my wedding ring. The silver band glinted faintly under the weak light. That ring had always meant promises kept. But now, it felt like a reminder of every promise I had broken in pursuit of loyalty to a man who had none. I'd run my thumb along the edge of the ring, thinking of my wife asleep in the next room, trusting me, believing I had a plan, and I'd feel like an imposter. Sometimes I replayed the meeting in my head. I could see Frank's smug smile, his wife's knowing smirk. I'd hear his words. "This is the reality. If you don't like it, there's the door." And my chest would tighten until I could barely breathe. The image of their $1 million house haunted me. I'd picture it late at night. The wide pillars, the pool reflecting moonlight, the SUVs parked in the driveway. I'd imagine them inside, laughing, clinking glasses of wine, while I sat in the dark with my unpaid bills. I hated that house. Not because it was grand, but because it had become a monument to my humiliation. Every brick felt like it had been bought with hours of my life. By the second month, the phone calls started. Friends checking in, co-workers asking what had happened, my mother-in-law wondering why my wife seemed distracted. I let the calls go to voicemail. I couldn't stand the thought of explaining. How could I tell them I had gambled everything on loyalty and lost? Isolation became my routine. I stayed indoors, curtains drawn, the glow of the television filling the silence. Days slipped by like smoke, indistinct, ungraspable. One night I caught my reflection in the darkened screen of the TV after it clicked off. My face looked older somehow, the lines deeper, the eyes duller. I barely recognized the man staring back. I whispered to myself, "Who are you without them?" The cold air rushed in, sharp against my skin, filling my lungs like a cleansing fire. I drove until the gas tank hovered near empty and ended up in a small coastal town 2 states away. The kind of place where time seemed slower, where salt hung in the air, and the horizon was nothing but water and sky. I checked into a cheap motel by the shore. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cleaning supplies, but when I opened the curtain, I saw the ocean stretching endless and restless. Something about that view steadied me. The first few days there, I did nothing but walk. Miles of beach beneath my shoes, waves crashing in rhythms that made sense when nothing else did. I carried my notebook with me, scribbling fragments of thoughts that didn't seem important at the time. Memories of my father's old sayings, half-formed reflections about loyalty, drawings of the cracked face of my watch. But as the pages filled, I felt lighter. There was a small diner near the motel. Greasy counters, locals who looked at me with polite curiosity, but didn't ask questions. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile, started recognizing me. "Coffee black?" she'd ask, sliding it across without waiting for me to answer. The warmth of that cup became an anchor. At night I sat on the sand with the waves at my feet and thought about everything I had lost and everything I hadn't. The house of betrayal, the weight of false loyalty, the suffocating silence of that kitchen table. Those were gone, left behind. What I still had was time, breath, and the faint whisper of my own voice returning. One evening, I took the wedding ring out of my pocket and held it up against the setting sun. The light caught in the silver band, turning it into a small flare of fire. I thought about what it meant. Not failure, not shame, but a promise to myself this time. A reminder that loyalty had to begin inward. I didn't throw it into the ocean, though the thought tempted me. Instead, I slid it onto the chain of the motel room key and wore it around my neck. A symbol reclaimed. Weeks passed. My money was thinning, but my spirit was not. For the first time, I woke without the crushing weight of dread. I filled mornings with long walks, afternoons with scribbled notes that began to take shape into essays, reflections, even plans. I had never thought of myself as a writer, but each word that spilled out felt like stitching torn fabric back together. One day the waitress asked, "You're staying a while?" "Maybe," I said, and I realized I meant it. The cracked watch still ticked. I checked it each morning before my walk, a small ritual that reminded me that broken time was still time. But the biggest change was internal. I no longer measured myself by the numbers in a bank account, the approval of a man in a suit, or the illusion of security. Instead, I measured days by moments of peace, the way the tide pulled back to reveal shells glistening in the sun, the sound of laughter from strangers in the diner, the simple act of breathing without feeling trapped. I wasn't healed. Not yet. The betrayal still lived inside me, a shadow that whispered at night. But I was no longer drowning. I was learning to swim. And with each passing tide, I felt something else stirring beneath the survival. Strength. The kind that doesn't shout or break things, but waits, watches, learns. The kind that bides its time until it's ready to rise. The ocean had become my metronome. Each tide that pulled back felt like another page turned, another hour claimed. For weeks, my routine was survival. Wake, walk, write, breathe. But something inside me shifted. The morning I looked down at my notebook and realized the pages weren't just fragments anymore. They had begun to form a story. Not about Frank, not about the company, not even about betrayal. It was about me. It was the question that gutted me, because I didn't have an answer. My watch ticked. The sound grew louder the longer I sat there, until I ripped it off my wrist and slammed it onto the table. The band snapped, a small crack forming in the glass. For a moment I just stared at it. This gift I once thought symbolized trust, now broken like everything else. The collapse wasn't just about money. It was about identity. I had built my self-worth around being the dependable one, the man who sacrificed without complaint. Without that role, I was adrift, hollowed out. And yet, amid the darkness, small sparks began to flicker. One afternoon, I went for a walk, not because I wanted to, but because the walls of the house were suffocating me. The air outside was crisp, the trees bare and skeletal. I walked without direction, just letting my feet carry me. At a park bench, I sat down and watched a boy chase after a soccer ball, laughing as his father jogged behind him. The sound of that laughter pierced something in me. For a moment, I remembered my own childhood, simpler times when running in the yard was enough, when joy wasn't tied to a paycheck or a boss's approval. I found myself smiling, faintly, for the first time in weeks. Another time at the grocery store, the cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, smiled at me when I fumbled for change. "Take your time," she said gently. It was such a small kindness, but it landed heavy. It reminded me I wasn't invisible, even if I felt like I was. Those moments didn't erase the despair, but they planted something fragile, a seed of possibility. At night, the darkness still pressed in, but I started noticing slivers of light I hadn't before. The warmth of my wife's hand when she reached for mine in her sleep, the smell of coffee in the morning, the way the sunlight cut across the living room floor. The collapse had stripped me bare. But maybe, just maybe, that meant I had a chance to rebuild. I wasn't ready yet. I was still raw, still bleeding inside. But the silence that once felt suffocating began to change. It no longer sounded like a void. It sounded like space. Empty, yes, but waiting to be filled. And in that emptiness, for the first time, I heard something I hadn't in years. My own voice. The decision to leave didn't come in a single burst of clarity. It was more like erosion, a slow, grinding recognition that staying in that house, surrounded by unopened bills and shadows of failure, was killing me. One morning, I woke to the sound of the mail slot clattering again. Another envelope slid onto the growing pile on the floor. I stood over it, the weight of it pressing against my chest, and something inside me cracked. I picked up the entire stack and dropped it into the trash without opening a single one. That night, while my wife slept, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the fractured watch on the wood surface. The second hand still ticked in uneven stutters, like a wounded animal refusing to die. I slipped the band back on my wrist anyway, the cracked glass biting against my skin. It felt like a reminder. Broken doesn't mean useless. The next morning, I packed a bag. No dramatic speeches, no cinematic goodbye. Just a small duffel with clothes, a notebook, and the wedding ring I slid into the pocket instead of on my finger. I kissed my wife on the forehead before she left for work, telling her I needed to clear my head. She didn't argue. She'd seen the darkness in my eyes for weeks, and maybe she knew this was survival. I got in the car and drove. No destination, just miles. The highway stretched out in front of me, grey ribbon unfurling through the early morning fog. With every passing mile marker, I felt a thin layer of suffocation peel off. The further I drove, the smaller that million-dollar house felt, the quieter Frank's smug voice became. For the first time in months, I rolled the windows down. The me who had once believed in hard work, who used to take pride in showing up early, in finishing last when others quit, in being dependable. Somewhere between all the broken promises, I had lost that man. But the words spilling across the paper showed me he wasn't gone, just buried. I started writing with discipline. 3 hours every morning, no excuses. At first it was jagged, sentences half-formed, ideas slipping between my fingers. But soon, the rhythm took hold. My pen scratched across the page with urgency, as though, if I stopped, I'd lose the voice I had only just rediscovered. The cracked watch sat beside me on the motel desk. Every time I looked at it, I thought of endurance. Its face was scarred, glass split in 2 sharp lines, but the hands kept moving. That watch had outlived humiliation, anger, despair, and it still ticked, just like me. The waitress at the diner noticed the change. "You've got colour back in your face," she said one afternoon, pouring coffee into my chipped mug. "Maybe I'm remembering who I am," I answered. She smiled like she understood. But remembering wasn't enough. I knew eventually survival had to give way to action. Because somewhere out there, Frank was still sitting in his million-dollar home, still driving those gleaming SUVs, still looking his employees in the eyes and telling them they weren't worth more. And though part of me wanted to stay hidden by the shore forever, another part, the stronger part, knew I had to return. But this time, not as the man who left. I started preparing. The first step was learning. I spent afternoons in the public library poring over books on employment law, corporate ethics, and whistleblower protections. It wasn't glamorous, and half the terminology made my head spin, but slowly I pieced things together. The lies Frank told about no budget weren't just unethical, they bordered on fraudulent. The tax filings, the business expenses masked as operations, the deliberate manipulation of salaries to fund personal luxuries, these weren't just betrayals of trust, they were potential crimes. I started collecting evidence. I knew enough from my years at the company to remember where records lived, what files might reveal the truth. I reached out to an old co-worker, someone I trusted. We spoke carefully, like spies in a movie, both aware of the risk. He confirmed what I suspected. The spending hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown worse. New renovations on the mansion, a third SUV, and employees still being told to tighten belts. People are furious, he told me, but everyone's scared. Don't be, I said, my hand tightening around the motel phone. Not for long. My transformation wasn't just legal or strategic, it was physical too. I forced myself into routines, morning runs on the beach until my lungs burned, push-ups on the motel carpet until my arms trembled, cold showers that jolted me awake. The body I had let decay under the weight of betrayal began to sharpen. Every bead of sweat felt like expelling weakness. Every mile run was a reclamation of ground once lost. And each night when exhaustion set in, I'd take the ring on the keychain and hold it in my palm. No longer a band of failure, it became my compass. A vow that I would never again surrender my worth for the comfort of someone else's lies. One evening I found myself standing on the pier, the cracked watch on my wrist glinting in the orange glow of sunset. The ocean below churned and foamed, restless, alive. For the first time I didn't just see water, I saw possibility. Time, like tide, never stops. It erodes cliffs, reshapes coastlines, buries what doesn't belong. And I realized that was me now, not broken, not even just surviving. I was reshaping. Weeks turned into months. Thus my notebook became 3, then 4, each filled with observations, plans, and reflections. I wrote out the day Frank told us, deal with it or quit. I described the way the conference room felt like a tomb. I wrote about the $4,500 offer, about how cheap he thought my dignity was. But I didn't write these as wounds. I wrote them as records, evidence, memory forged into weaponry. By the time I was ready to leave that coastal town, I wasn't the man who had arrived with a broken watch and a duffel bag full of clothes. I was a man with a mission. The last morning in the motel, I packed slowly, folded each shirt, slid the notebooks into my bag with care. Before I checked out, I paused by the window, looking one last time at the ocean's endless horizon. The tide rolled in and out like a promise. Return if you need to. But now, go. I slipped the ring on the keychain into my pocket, adjusted the cracked watch on my wrist, and walked out the door. I didn't feel like I was running anymore. I felt like I was advancing. The first time I walked back into the city after months away, I hardly recognized it. The glass towers looked the same, the traffic hummed its usual dirge, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't returning as a man desperate for approval. I was returning as someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. The cracked watch ticked on my wrist as I crossed the street toward the office I once called home. Its face was still broken, but the hands never stopped moving. That was my reminder. Scars didn't mean defeat. They meant survival. I had come prepared. The notebooks I filled at the motel had been refined into reports, timelines, and legal briefs. I had spoken with attorneys, filed complaints, gathered testimony from employees too afraid to step forward alone. What had once been whispered frustration was now documented evidence. Frank had built his empire on silence. I had returned with a voice loud enough to shatter it. The confrontation didn't happen in a dark alley or a bar, but happened exactly where it needed to, inside the company walls. When I pushed open the glass door, the receptionist's eyes widened. She said my name softly, almost like she was seeing a ghost. Maybe in some way she was. "Is he in?" I asked. Her voice faltered. "Yes, but he's in a meeting." "Good," I said. "So am I." I walked down the corridor, my shoes striking the polished floor with deliberate weight. Every step was a reclamation. The conference room loomed at the end, its frosted glass hiding the silhouettes inside. I paused for a moment, fingers brushing the ring on my keychain in my pocket. Then I opened the door. Silence fell the moment I entered. Frank was seated at the head of the table, his suit pressed, his tie gleaming like arrogance woven into silk. His wife sat beside him, her jewelry catching the light like shards of accusation. Around the table, managers shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between me and him. "Surprise," I said, my voice calm, steady. "Remember me?" Frank smirked, though a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. "Well, well. Thought you took your little payout and disappeared." "I did," I replied. "And in disappearing I found something." He leaned back. "And what's that?" "My spine." The room tightened. I laid a folder on the table and slid it toward him. Inside was everything. Records, timelines, expenses disguised as business operations, testimonies from employees who had been silenced. Each page was another crack in the glass facade he had built. "You told us there was no budget for raises," I said. "Meanwhile, you and your wife bought a $1 million mansion, 3 luxury SUVs, and labeled them as business assets. You starved your employees while feeding yourselves." Frank's jaw clenched, but his smirk wavered. "You think you can prove—" "I don't have to prove it," I cut in. "It's already in motion. Legal filings, state, agencies, even the press. I just came here to look you in the eye when I told you, your silence is broken." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of my watch. Frank tried to laugh it off, but the sound fell flat. His managers shifted, whispers starting at the far end of the table. His wife's hands trembled against her necklace. "You always thought we needed you," I continued. "That we'd accept crumbs while you dined like kings. That we'd stay silent because we were afraid. But the tide turned, Frank. And when the tide turns, no amount of money can hold it back." I looked at him one last time, not with rage, but with clarity. The man who once terrified me with his power now looked small, shrunken by his own greed, cornered by his own lies. "I took your offer back then," I said. "Not because I needed your money, because I needed my freedom. That $4,500 wasn't a bribe. It was my ticket out. And I've spent every day since building something you can't buy back. My life." I gathered my things, the room still heavy with stunned silence. As I walked toward the door, I paused. "You once told me to deal with it or quit." I turned to face him fully. "Well, Frank, now it's your turn. Deal with it." And with that, I left. The days that followed unfolded like a tide rushing in. Investigations were launched. Employees finally found their voices, many of them calling me to say thank you. The mansion that once glittered on the hill became a headline, a symbol of greed and arrogance. Frank's empire, built on silence, began to collapse under the weight of truth. But for me, the greatest victory wasn't his downfall. It was the peace I carried. Back at the coast, I stood once more on the pier, watching the horizon. The ring on my keychain gleamed faintly in the fading light, no longer a symbol of loss, but of loyalty. To myself. The cracked watch ticked steadily, a reminder that broken things still endure. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, vast and alive, and for the first time in years, I felt the future calling. Not as something to fear, but as something wide open. Betrayal had broken me, survival had remade me, and now justice had set me free.